What's up everyone, it's Dakota and welcome back to another Magic the Gathering video, and I got some gameplay for you today with one of my favorite decks currently in the standard format in the Jeskai Convoke deck. This has been a deck that I think is very good in the metagame currently with all the mid-range decks kind of running around, plus the various aggro decks. I think it just has a pretty solid matchup against both of them. You just kind of have to hope to dodge like domain and mono white control and things like that. Even though I don't think you're necessarily like the biggest dog, those are definitely the matchups that you don't want to face because they just have a bunch of annoying removal and a bunch of sweepers, which is really what this deck would like to avoid at all costs. And the fact that they play multiples of them feels pretty rough. But, you know, we're going to bring you some Jeskai Convoke gameplay today, for the fact that, again, I really just enjoy playing this deck, and I had a very interesting match in one of my leagues that I would like to kind of show off and kind of break down for you all today. But, of course, before we get too deep into the details of the Jeskai Convoke deck and get into the match that we played today, if you're not already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more videos from me, we're focusing mainly on standard for this current RCQ season, but we do dabble in the modern and pioneer format, as well as some other longer form videos. So if anything that interests you, please consider subscribing and ring that notification bell so you know when those videos get posted. It's a free, easy way to support me and my content. And if you are so interested, go ahead and check out the Casual Spikes podcast that is in the description down below. Me and my co-host Randy over at Modern with Randy talk about whatever the current RCQ season is and talk about the various different formats of Magic that are very competitive and the ones that we enjoy, while also some other news and stuff going on in the community. So if that interests you, please go over there and subscribe. The link is in the description down below, along with my Discord server and, of course, the link, or my code rather, for Manatraders if you're interested in signing up, where you can get 5% off your monthly subscription. Now, with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk Jeskai Convoke really quick. So, Jeskai Convoke is kind of this deck that existed before in Standard, where it was more of like the Boros Convoke deck, and we even saw it in Pioneer quite a bit, where it could put a bunch of power into play. And while we do not have the Venerated Loxodon to put a bunch of power into play, we do have Knight Errant of Eos as like a top-end card that we can, in a lot of cases, play for free on turn 2. That is going to give us some kind of card advantage here. So it's essentially a 5-mana 4/4 with Convoke. Then when it enters, you look at the top 6 cards of the library. You may reveal up to 2 creature cards with mana value X or less from among them, where X is the number of creatures that convoked Knight Errant of Eos. Put the revealed cards in your hand and then shuffle. So Knight Errant of Eos will actually, potentially give you some card advantage. If you tap 5 creatures to cast Knight Errant of Eos, you're going to be able to get other Knight Errant of Eoses and kind of chain them together to kind of, hopefully hit one of your more impactful like late game creatures, aka like turn 3 turn 4 creatures, one of them being Immodange Recruiter being the big one here, and we'll kind of show you how we're able to abuse Immodange Recruiter. But a 3-mana 2/2 that when it enters, creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain haste until end of turn, including itself. So it's essentially a 3-mana 3/2 on turn 1 that is going to put a bunch of more power into play depending on how many creatures you actually have. And the way that we do this is thankfully with cards like Novice Inspector, Spyglass Siren, in conjunction with Gleeful Demolition. So Novice Inspector, when it enters the battlefield, makes a clue for 1 mana. Spyglass Siren, a 1-mana 1/1 flyer that does create a map token, which are both artifacts, meaning that when we play Gleeful Demolition on turn 2, we're able to destroy our own artifact, and then we are able to create 3 1/1 red Phyrexian Goblin creature tokens due to the fact that we controlled the artifact. So this means if we play a Novice Inspector on turn 1, then go turn 2 Gleeful Demolition into, say, another 1-drop, then we are able to cast Knight Errant of Eos for free, tapping all of our creatures. If we don't have Knight Errant of Eos, we're really hoping to find a card like Warden of the Inner Sky. This is just an absolute house. It has flying and vigilance if it has 3 or more counters on it. So if you are somehow able, this deck doesn't really put different kinds of counters on our creatures, but if you're able to put like a flying counter on it, a menace counter, something like that, it does count towards that number. But a lot of the times you're just going to be putting 3 +1/+1 counters on this, and then it's going to end up being a 4/5 flying vigilance creature that's going to be great on offense as well as defense. And you can tap 3 untapped artifacts and or creatures you control to put +1/+1 counters on Warden in the Inner Sky and Scry 1, which will help you to kind of filter out some draws where maybe you're hoping to find, again, like Immodange Recruiter, or maybe even like Case of the Gateway Express, which is essentially a removal spell. I can get rid of bigger creatures, the more creatures that you control, which kind of helps in the tempo game against some of the other mid-range decks where, they play a big threat on turn 4, tapping out, and you're able to just, flood the board with a bunch of creatures, play a Case of the Gateway Express, attack for a bunch, manage to solve the case, and then even if your opponent has like 1 or 2 removal spells for your creatures, you kind of make that power up by solving Case of the Gateway Express. So definitely some interesting stuff here. I've preferred the Painter Studio / Deface Gallery over some of the other cards. Some people have been playing for Shelter by Ghosts, and maybe that is correct with enough of the aggro kind of meta kind of coming up in popularity. probably towards like the rate that we see the mid-range decks, but I really like this as essentially an anthem effect for our creature's power when, without Case of the Gateway Express needing to have creatures on the battlefield to flip it. The face gallery, I think, is a totally fine play. Like later on, it's essentially other copies of Mid-Range Recruiter. You can't get this off of a Knight Errant Evios, obviously, but this is a way that you can kind of give a bunch of your creatures +1/+0 whenever you attack, and again, kind of make things awkward for your opponent very early, rather than trying to flip Case or having to play an Mid-Range Recruiter. So it's just really nice here. But we are also playing 2 Shelter by Ghosts in the main. We have the other 2 in the sideboard. This is going to get rid of a non-land permanent opponent controls and giving your creature +1/+0 lifelink and ward 2. Very nice to slap on a Knight Errant Evios because you're just going to be able to slap your opponent for 5, gain 5, and the creature's already going to be super tough to deal with just on combat, in combat. So giving it ward 2 is also going to be pretty tough to deal with. You can also put it like on a Spyglass Siren, which isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world either, to where you can kind of just get in for that flying damage. Your opponent's going to have a hard time blocking it, and they're not really going to want to spend a removal spell on it either. So just something interesting there. And then the mana base, nothing really special about it, just a bunch of dual lands in Adakar Waste, Battlefield Forge. We have the 1 Plains, Seachrome Coast, Shivan Reef, and Spire Bluff Canal. But, with all that said, let's go ahead, we'll dive into the match, and hope you all enjoy it, and I will see you all in the game. So here we have game 1. We don't know what our opponent's playing, and we decide to keep this hand. They mulligan to 6, and they get to play first. So the reason why I kept this hand, if we have a Spyglass Siren, Ward in the Inner Sky, this is kind of the card that I was talking about earlier, where we really want to get this going pretty early. So kind of with how our hand set up, we are able to play like a Ward in the Inner Sky, play a Spyglass Siren on turn 2, and as you'll see here, I'll make a mistake, but we have Spyglass Siren plus Gleeful Demolition plus a Deface Gallery, which means that we can get just a ton of early damage in, which is going to add roughly 5 power every time we attack, plus any counters that we put on Ward in the Other Sky. So we're just going to have a ton of damage here. We have a little bit of card advantage later with the Painter Studio side, and especially with our opponent mulliganing. I like where we're at, so we end up, again, being on the draw. We see Surveil Land here. This definitely, at least at the time, signaled to me domain, like almost 100%. Like this is domain. There's a few like green blue decks kind of floating around. We went over one in our budget decks to play, but for me that wasn't on my radar, at least at the time I played this match. I was definitely thinking more domain than anything. So not a deck that we necessarily want to play against. We draw our basic planes, so not good. Definitely want to keep drawing gas, but we get on Spyglass Siren here, and that's probably just from me thinking that it doesn't really matter what we lead. I know that thinking of this matchup being potentially domain, maybe my opponent wanted to use their 2-mana removal spell and like get lost on my Ward in the Inner Sky. Obviously, after drawing the land, I would have rather played the Ward in the Inner Sky, and you'll see the kind of the mistake here I make, where I play the Ward in the Inner Sky first. Or rather, I guess I go Gleeful Demolition and then Ward in the Inner Sky, so I ensure that I'm able to activate it. I wasn't going to be attacking with the Ward in the Inner Sky, so probably the mistake that you see there is that I could have just played the Warden first, activated it, got the Scry, and then Gleeful Demolition, the map token, make 3 goblins, and I could have potentially gotten an extra counter on my Warden, and we end up scrying to the bottom anyway, so that could have potentially made a difference. Like this point of damage probably doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things, because we're going to get that point back on the Warden, but they do have Get Lost, so maybe I wouldn't have gotten necessarily that far, and we're kind of in trouble here. We don't really have a whole lot going on here. As you can see, we just have like this Deface Gallery. I mean, it is going to add 4 power to the board. This is end up going to be an attack for 8, plus potentially whatever this map token finds, if we don't really have anything else going on. We draw, of course, we draw another Spire Bluff Canal. We're kind of flooding out pretty hard here. We crack the map. Our opponent looks like there's going to binding our Siren, so then we don't end up actually getting the Explorer with the map token, but we get in for 6 here. Like really, I think at this point, if we find like Imidane's Recruiter, this is going to make like 3, 5, 7, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So actually an Imidane's Recruiter off the top here, if our opponent doesn't have anything, is lethal, believe it or not. It's kind of a crazy thing to think about with this deck. But, of course, we're holding on to 3 lands. If we have like at least one, definitely two spells, obviously all three spells, I think we're in a pretty good place. They end up going for the herd migration and end up going for a swamp and playing swamp. This does give them, the ability to play a 2-mana leyline binding. We find Clockwork Percussionist, which isn't like super exciting here. Really, probably what I end up going here for is unlocking the Painter's Studio to kind of, go look at some other cards. Our opponent, though, getting rid of the Painter's Studio, this is kind of okay for us. I mean, in a way, like if we find the Shelter by Ghost, we'll be able to get it back, but both the rooms will be locked. So I think we'll have to unlock at least one of the rooms. But with the amount of mana we have, getting to Shelter by Ghost this and then unlock the Deface Gallery isn't really going to be much of a problem here. We end up finding, I believe it was another land and then a Novice Inspector. So we have the option, we can play the Novice Inspector, but I believe we can cast this on our next turn anyway. So I think I end up just playing the Novice Inspector. Probably could have just got away with playing the Clockwork Percussionist. Getting an extra point now instead of later, probably not going to matter too much again, because like once we kind of get into the late game, the domain decks tend to take over here, and they play a Lush Portico and put up the Beanstalk in their graveyard, which really isn't good for us, which means they probably just have a lot of interaction, ideally, because, I mean, this would just end up being kind of a free card, which we see here. They're going to scroll shift, they're going to get rid of this binding, and they're actually going to give us back the Painter Studio, and they're going to take the Novice Inspector, which then we see the Clockwork Percussionist, we unlock this, we get him for 8 damage, putting them to 5, and they need to deal with, so as it stands right now, even if they deal with one creature, they end up dying still because they take 6 damage from here. We do have a clue token. We do have another Novice Inspector. We have a bunch of mana to kind of play with. So we're definitely not in the worst shape here. This is kind of rough because this does technically do it. But with them basically being tapped out, no white mana open, if we just draw like our Shelter by Ghost to get rid of one of these tokens, that's totally fine, because again, we have 6 power here. If we find like Imitating Recruiter, or we find like the other Clockwork Percussionist, we can end up kind of pushing through damage there, because no matter how they slice it, they're going to take 6. So, their Mistborn ticks down, we draw, and we draw Spire Bluff Canal. Not good. We're going to crack the clue token. We do find the Percussionist, though. Unless our opponent is playing some kind of bounce spell, they will get it, but they do not. Clutch Clockwork Percussionist, again, we had 4 Imitating Recruiter, I believe, still, and then we also had this Clockwork Percussionist, so we had like 5 looks at it. Also the fact, too, that we cracked the clue here, we still have a Painter Studio kind of open to us to play for that turn, and then play another land, and potentially, hopefully find, something good. Ideally, off of this unlock, possibly find like a, find like the Night Errant Evios to convoke it out and potentially get some card advantage. Opponent only has 1 card in hand. This Mistborn is kind of taking down, so maybe if they kind of brick for another turn, or maybe even if they just have like spot removal instead of something like a temporary lockdown, then we're in pretty good shape there. But that was game number 1. I will meet you guys over for game number 2 here in a moment. So here we are for game 2, and I admit, kind of looking back on it, I don't like how I sideboard. I took out all the Case of the Gateway Expresses. We're not really going to be killing anything, so I'm kind of okay with taking this card out. I think cutting the Night Errant and the Gleeful Demolition was probably too much. It was probably more or less cutting the Sheltered by Ghosts and playing something else in here. We brought in the 4 counter spells that basically rely on us having creatures to be able to counter our opponent's spells, essentially trying to put a bunch of power into play and then protect it with that from 1 sweeper, and then hopefully killing our opponent in 2 swings. And then I believe, too, we ended up bringing in the 2 Ghost, the enchantment. So don't necessarily like that. More or less, of course, that hand was absolute garbage. 5 lands. There's like a theme for this, but I don't think Shelter by Ghosts is all that good. While it does have Ward, the fact that our opponent does have various different rats, I don't think this is all that great. And if we end up getting something like a Leyline Binding, that's just kind of like a small thing compared to just putting actual like creatures in our deck, like having Gleeful Demolition or something like that in the deck. So this hand, I believe we end up keeping, which I think then like the Imitating Recruiter goes to the bottom. So just this hand, like, it's totally fine. Again, this is another kind of like Warden in the Inner Sky game where we're going to end up playing this, I believe, on turn 2 to hopefully kind of set us up to, scry a little bit, get some kind of card selection going, and then hopefully kind of drawing out of our little mulligan here. Our opponent does keep 7, so does kind of suck. Or no, they end up going to 6 as well. So we both mulligan to 6 to start. They lead on a Lush Portico, milling a land. We draw another land and then play this Warden in the Inner Sky first. Don't ask me why, because again, it probably won't make much sense. I think I'm thinking here that if my opponent does play something on turn 2, which, you know, if they play like a Up the Beanstalk, I'm kind of fine with, you know, playing a Shelter by Ghost on the Warden in the Inner Sky, because we're going to be able to grow it even bigger, and then hopefully, ideally, you know, get in. Also, more than likely, what I was thinking at that time was just playing like Novice Inspector, Clockwork Percussionist, and then be able to like add the counters to it, and then be able to attack for 2, which essentially would be the same thing if playing like a Clockwork Percussionist on turn 1, something like that, and then playing like Warden plus Novice, and then using those to tap and then attacking for 1. So kind of the same thing, maybe a little bit worse because our opponent could just have a removal spell for this, but you know, that's more than likely what I was thinking at the time. But I think that this is kind of a mistake, considering that we've played game 1 where we wanted to protect this until we could put it into play, and then also put a counter on it, and potentially even put a second counter on it as well, and we failed to do that. But of course, drawing our 4th land now, not ideal. You know, so here we go. We have Inspector. We end up playing the Spirebluff Canal, playing this, and then activating to put a counter on this. We see another Shelter by Ghost. We end up putting it to the bottom. I don't think we wanted 2 of them. Of course, we get hit with Elspeth Smite. So like that's probably a reason to not do that. That I think that normally comes out of their sideboard. And then this is just kind of like a beating. They get to go into Overlord, you know, filter through, kind of sculpt their hand a little bit. This coming down in a few turns. We have Gleeful Demolition here, so thankfully we didn't break our token here. We get this off the board, and we just start getting in damage. You know, I think is probably more or less where we want to be. We're looking for an Imitating Recruiter at this point. And of course, now we get temporary lockdown, and like from there, I mean, like this game is practically over. I mean, we lost all of our tokens. Our opponent just kind of has a firm grip on the game. They actually get an Overlord of the Flood Pits in play. Yeah, and then we just concede here because we just end up drawing another land. So, I mean, we drew 4 spells. Was that about right? 4 or 5 spells. Or we drew 5 spells and 5 lands. Obviously not the ratio that we're hoping for, but you know, it is what it is. We kind of get clapped by this because, again, I think this is a pretty bad matchup, especially in the post-sideboard games. Thankfully, we won game 1, and we have a chance to win a sideboard game on the play. So let's go ahead and jump over to game number 3 and hope that we can kind of clutch this out. So here we are for game number 3. Just to have a little bit of context, I believe game 1 and 2 combined in real time took like 10 minutes to play both games. We know game 2 was pretty short, but like game 1 was also pretty short, all things considered. We got a mulligan again. You know, I think that was another like 5 lander, 2 spells. This is basically, you know, honestly, I didn't think both games really came down to keep on Warden in the Inner Sky and then like doing the thing. But here, I decided to bring in Get Lost over the, I believe, the Shelter by Ghost. You know, just from that, I still left the cases out. I think that's totally fine. So we went down to 2 Shelter by Ghost, and we brought in some of the Get Lost, and I even brought in the, whatever it is, the Night Errant of Eos back in to kind of bring in the 3rd Get Lost there. So we ended up cutting 2 Get Lost and cutting the 2 Get Lost and bringing in the Shelter by Ghost, bringing in the Get Lost. My goodness, my brain is absolutely fried. I'm not exactly sure if this is necessarily a matchup where we want to see something like Urbrask's Forge. I kind of like Urbrask's Forge against like the non-white decks of the format, but you know, that's just me personally. But yeah, and we go turn 1 Warden in the Inner Sky. I think this is totally fine. On the play, we're essentially just going to be main phasing this Resolute and getting counters on it, and hoping to play around any of the Elspeth Smites. So here we find an Imitating Recruiter. Finally, we end up playing this Resolute Reinforcements. We tap, and then we keep the the Spyglass Siren on top. Our opponent has access to white mana. We play the Spyglass Siren, play the land, and then we're going to activate this Warden. Have a Get Lost. We're going to put it on the bottom since we already have a Get Lost. We're going to get in for 4 damage, ideally. And our opponent has Not on My Watch. And this is already pretty brutal. I mean, like, the Imitating Recruiter isn't necessarily going to be the worst thing in the world, but, like, still not in a great place. Then they have, like, their ideal turn 3 in Overlord of the Hauntwoods to be able to ramp themselves up to 4 mana. We're looking kind of at 5 mana. We end up getting to put a counter on this thing, which I think we end up binning this Night Errant of Eos off of it. So we get in some damage. We have Protect the Negotiators. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to kill in the next turn, even with like, you know, if we had like land 1-drop, which it might have been fine to just get in for, you know, 3 damage here. And then leave up Protect the Negotiators kicked, so then we can make a 1/1, and then obviously counter, hopefully, their 5-mana Wrath. And then, like, Imitated Recruiter technically gets in more damage there and ends up getting, like, 2, 4, 8, 2, 4, 8, 11 damage. So, and they're at, like, 8 after that, and I believe then that's lethal on board. 4, 5, 6, like, potentially lethal on the next turn, depending on what we draw. But, you know, we decide to just kind of leave up the counter spell, and that's just kind of like the hill we're going to live on here for a little bit, because we just kind of don't want to get blown out. But, you know, we end up attacking first. I believe I'm going to play this Warden. I kind of debated on if I want to counter whatever, so I decided I'm just going to get rid of the removal spell here. Like, I don't think I necessarily can kind of wait any longer. That's probably a mistake there. I probably should just always save that for, you know, a potential Wrath, because we kind of open ourselves up here to just them playing Sunfall or whatever, you know, and getting, you know, a 4/4 token in play that they're gonna have to pay to flip later. But chances are, with all their mana and stuff, they're gonna be able to play it and then potentially flip it, given whatever's going on here. But like, my hand is also pretty weak as well, so it was kind of a debate on, like, do I want to push through this 2 points of damage? Maybe that was very aggressive on my part to fire this off and then even like kick it as well. It probably would have been safer just to play Warden in the Inner Sky, and then maybe gets a little bit of value on the Warden, to where even if they do Wrath, I'm kind of set up with like another card on top, rather than kind of getting in that damage. So that's probably my bad there. And of course, here's the temporary lockdown, instant punish. You know, if we end up getting these creatures back, though, that's going to be a pretty big game. And I mean, we do have the get lost for this temporary lockdown. So, you know, we do kind of have some things that we can do here. One more turn this Overlord, we end up drawing a tap land, which is not ideal. Of course, we do not have a double white, which is kind of a problem that I've noticed when playing this deck a lot, is the fact that a lot of the times it feels like you need a bunch of white mana to do things, and you only ever have like a lot of blue and red, and like one single white source, or, you know, you need red mana and you only have like one red mana source, and you have a bunch of Adakar wastes and things like that. So I decided here we're going to get lost this, and we're just going to immediately crack our map token. And we end up finding a Plains, so that ends up allowing us to cast the Warden in the Inner Sky, and then just kind of decide, okay, like, we'll lose to another Wrath. Our opponent's going to get lost. I believe we're still going to get Scry. We leave the Gallery Room on top, because that's just going to help us to push through damage. And we're going to have a potential turn where we can, you know, Gallery Room to get in damage, and then Imitated Recruiter to get in more damage. Our opponent goes Flood Pits Overlord. They end up having, you know, the ability to play their whatever Leyline Binding if they end up playing one with their one available white here. This Overlord comes off, then they have those Flood Pits in play. It is not looking good, especially this Flood Pits just having flying is very annoying, and then getting to draw 2 and discard a card. They're going to get to draw for their turn, they're going to be able to draw 2 more cards. You know, essentially they're just going to kind of a pretty stacked hand. So, I mean, to say that it's an uphill battle here, it would, you know, be an understatement. Like, this is awful for us. So then, instead of playing the gallery side, I actually play Painter Studio to get a little bit of card advantage going here, and we actually flip over another Painter Studio as well. So we kind of start putting counters on Warden in the Inner Sky. We're just trying to kind of find some things to do here, and we actually end up finding a Gleeful Demolition after bottoming another Spyglass Siren. So this is going to kind of help us to get some more creatures on the board to kind of abuse Deface Gallery, but of course then they Leyline Binding our Deface Gallery. But kind of like where we're at here, I mean, we do have Deface Gallery into like Imitated Recruiter. So this ends up being, you know, essentially +2 to everything. So 4 or 5, you know, that's 10 damage there, 12, 15, 16, 17, 18 damage just from like that line of play here, which is really nice. Our opponent, though, obviously is going to get to draw 2 cards. So not really looking good still. They do obviously have some options here, like if they remove like Deface Gallery before we get to attack, then, you know, it's only attack for like 3, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. They only go to 1, so, you know, kind of need it. Our opponent taps a bunch of mana. You know, maybe they're thinking about Wrathing, which I don't think they necessarily do, because they are pretty far ahead. They just decide to actually impend a Mist Overlord of the Mistmoor. So again, not really ideal, but of course then we still have this Gleeful Demolition as well. So we do kind of have some ability like set up here. Like, of course, like these are not ideal, but thankfully they impended this and didn't actually cast it. So they're not going to be able to attack and make more tokens and be able to be kind of aggressive. You know, we're going to play this Painter Studio on the one half, and we're just going to kind of set ourselves up to kind of doing hopefully some great things. And we have another Imidane's Recruiter here as well with a Gleeful Demolition that we are going to, I believe, put on top of our library. So we do have this kind of ability where we're going to be able to, even after that, play Gleeful Demolition, and then we end up having like enough mana to then play an Imidane's Recruiter and you know, just kind of go off in a sense, you know, like be able to blow this up, play Recruiter, unlock Deface Gallery, get in for tons of damage here. So kind of see what our opponent does. They end up revealing another Overlord of the Mistmoors, which is not ideal. They get to attack, they draw it. We are obliged to block here with one of our creatures. Going to 4 and things looking very grim. They just end up playing another Overlord of the Flood Pits for its impending cost, and then I believe they end up just playing another Mistmoors. So again, like not the most ideal thing in the world. It's kind of rough here, but you know, it kind of is what it is at this point. But nonetheless, we still Gleeful Demolition. Then we end up getting to cast a Imidane's Recruiter, unlock this Defaced Gallery to ensure that we end up getting in as much damage as we possibly can. And we attack with every single one of our creatures here, getting in tons of damage. They have a smite, Elspeth Smite. Doesn't matter. They block 2 of our 3 power creatures. Then they take 15 damage and take lethal. When I tell you that the wheels were definitely turning while I'm kind of looking through this, I was like, you know, if I can just get a turn where I can just double pump my power here, where I can play Imidane's Recruiter or go like Recruiter into Recruiter, or, you know, again, this Deface Gallery into Recruiter, something like that, we were going to be in pretty okay shape. And the fact that we actually pulled out this game is insane, considering how many cards that my opponent drew. I mean, they were almost halfway through their library at this point. They had played an Elspeth Smite, they had Get Lost, they had their own Leyline Binding, and the fact that they impended Overlord of the Mistmoors instead of just playing it out, you know, they played an Overlord of the Flood Pits, and then they had an Overlord of the Mistmoors. Of course, again, they can't necessarily, I guess, play around like me going Deface Gallery and Imidane's Recruiter, but the fact that they didn't have that extra blocker back, and they ended up again playing this Overlord of the Flood Pits and then impending this instead of just outright playing this and, you know, just saying go ahead, because I believe they have 3, 6, 7, 8, 9 mana, so they just play this and they leave back an Elspeth Smite. This is a completely different game, you know. Our opponent attacking for lethal, kind of wanting to force the block because then we have like another creature, but then they also have like a flying insect token they can make, and you know, I think my opponent just played kind of loose, because honestly for them, like I probably would have played in the same way, where I would have just like, you know, I'm just gonna play out a bunch of things, like there's no way you can kill me from here, go ahead. And it's like, oh, I didn't actually do the math sort of thing. So I think a rough game for them to lose, when I think the fact that we got what was it, we got temporary lockdown pretty early for just a bunch of things that we had on the battlefield, and then kind of like some key cards getting Leyline Binding, and of course like our opponent having double Overlord, double Overlord of the Flood Pits, double Overlord of the Mistmoors, and even a Overlord of the Hauntwoods to get some ramp going, and just all the different cards they kind of get to filter through and everything. It's a pretty rough game to lose, but overall, you know, we end up pulling it out. We win the game, and we end up going on to 4-1 this league, losing to Mono White. Unfortunately, couldn't get that lucky. We won one of the games and just could not win one of the other ones. But it's something that I really enjoy playing this Jeskai Convoke deck, and I hope that I can get some gameplay of the Dimir midrange deck, because I've been absolutely loving just kind of messing around with that deck and playing it. Because again, I think it's one of the best decks to play in the format, and I think probably the best of the 2 midrange decks that people are currently playing online. But you know, I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a like on the video. Comment down below what you think of Jeskai Convoke, maybe what you think of the domain deck, anything like that. I would love to hear your thoughts just overall on the standard format as a whole. Of course, subscribe to the channel, ring the notification bell, check out Manatraders, sponsor of the video, or excuse me, sponsor of the channel, the Casual Spikes podcast, all that fun stuff that you find in the description. But yeah, that's going to do it for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope to see you all in the next one.